Thug life, the other civil rights movement. In the sweltering August heat of Ferguson, Missouri, less than a stone's throw from where Officer Darren Wilson had pumped 6 bullets into the body of Michael Brown Jr., I clenched the rock-tossing hand of a 19-year-old kid I had met a few hours earlier. A few feet away, a multifarious conglomerate of long gun-wielding cops, Missouri state troopers, and actual soldiers stood ready to use any means necessary to suppress any unrest. Earlier that day, this same kid had described how Ferguson cops terrorized a young black man in the neighborhood where Mike Brown died. Now he was ready to set it off. I remembered how he complained about the media describing protesters as thugs. I pointed to a woman in a wheelchair and said that he was putting everyone in danger, begging him not to toss the first stone. I explained how the authorities and the media would ascribe his actions to all the peaceful protesters. "Like that shit matters," he replied with eyes full of water and desperation. "Can't you see? They're gonna kill us anyway." We stood there for a second. Or a minute. Or forever, with my hand around his wrist, his frustration in his palm. A millisecond before I decided to let his arm go, a brick sailed over our head into the armed brigade. As they began marching toward us, we both bolted. I paused to put on a gas mask and spotted him through the noxious fumes. Perhaps he was only checking his surroundings, but I could swear that he was staring directly at me. As he disappeared into the smoking chaos, I ran away knowing the world would ignore the hundreds of peaceful protesters and attribute this civil unrest to thugs. Nearly 2 years later, 2 Department of Justice civil rights investigations forced the Ferguson City Council to accept a consent decree implementing new use of force policies and de-escalation training along with restructuring the municipal court system. Darren Wilson was never brought to justice, but the peaceful protests had partially worked. It was evidence that reasonable people can collectively force change. Or maybe it was the thugs that helped push it all forward. If we believed the whitewashed, safe-for-work version of the civil rights struggle, we would believe that a lone white man killed Emmett Till, jolting black people out of a dreamlike state to suddenly realize that we didn't have all the rights afforded to us by the U.S. Constitution. In response, Martin Luther King Jr. convinced everyone to hold hands and march peacefully until he could remember his dream. When he told the world about it at the March on Washington, America suddenly saw the error in its ways and handed black people their humanity, and everyone lived happily ever after. That is the Cliff Snow's version of the civil rights struggle that exists in our collective whitewashed memory and is sold in social studies classes across America. Through a complex combination of whitewashing, guilt, and an intentional recasting of history that absolves them of their hatred, our historical translators have painted a sanitized, impressionist portrait of a struggle for black liberation that was eventually fulfilled by America's unwavering commitment to justice and equality. Out of whole cloth, they managed to fabricate a fantastic, ahistorical myth that somehow became true. They remember a socially conservative, respectable campaign of racial reconciliation, not a movement of anti-establishment revolutionaries. And for their sake, the doctrine of nonviolent resistance was eventually reduced to simple nonviolence. They never speak of the resisting. As long as America has existed, black men and women have been engaged in a fight for full equality and liberty. But unlike the fairy tale version would have you believe, the struggle has never been passive, nor has black resistance been nonviolent. In their quest to get free, black people have always availed themselves of the right to self-defense and armed resistance. Of course, this would lead to them being characterized as criminals or malcontents. There is a difference between how one chooses to defend oneself and how one chooses to address social, economic, and political inequality through protest. The former is a personal choice, while the latter is an organizing strategy. The truth is, peaceful protest was just one tactic used by a small arm of what we call the civil rights movement. Essie Harris became a leader of Chatham County, North Carolina's black community by shooting it out with the Klan. Although he was not interested in politics, Harris attended a few meetings of his local Loyal League, a black political group that organized voters. When Klansmen attacked his home a few days after Christmas 1870 to take his gun and warn him about voting, Harris initially complied. But when they shot up his home, wounding him in the arm and riddling his house with bullets, Harris figured his wife and 5 children were dead. He grabbed an axe and chopped one of the Klansmen in the head, then picked up his gun to finish off the rest of the mob. "They always said in my country that a man cannot kill a Ku Klux," Harris told an 1871 joint committee investigating the white supremacist insurrection in the South. They said that they could not be hit, that if they were, the ball would bounce back and kill you. I thought, though, that I would try it and see if my gun would hit one. Even though Harris had never loaded his shotgun with anything deadlier than squirrel shot, he blasted one of the Klansmen in the face. It worked. The shots did not bounce back and kill him. When he realized that the KKK were not impervious to any kind of bullet, Harris wanted to try it again, telling legislators they said they were going to set my house on fire, that they did not intend to leave there till they had done it. I thought they were going to do it. I was just as certain as they were as that I was in there. I had some shot. I have often heard people talk about a man being so scared that he could not shoot people, but they had been there so long my fear is over. I had no fear at all by that time. Not a bit. I went to my little wallet where I kept my shot and powder. The men were standing behind the chimney waiting for them to carry off the shot one, I reckon. Some 8 or 10 of them stand after the rest had started, saying they were going to set my house on fire. I loaded my gun again. I put an uncommon load in it, a dangerous load. After I had got it almost loaded, I said, "Give me hold of my 5-shooter. They said, "Boys, the old man is calling for his 5-shooter and loading his gun. Let us leave." Upon that, they went off. Essie Harris then walked 14 miles to the next county with a bullet in his arm to file a warrant against the Klansmen. He went back home and waited for them to be arrested. "I was the last man who shot a gun at my house," he said. Using guns to face the ongoing terrorist threat posed by white supremacy wasn't limited to Klan violence. It also figured heavily in the ongoing struggle against police brutality. On Monday, July 23, 1900, Robert Charles was sitting on the porch of a New Orleans house with his roommate when 3 white police officers began investigating reports of 2 suspicious-looking Negroes roaming around the predominantly white neighborhood. When the officers asked them what they were doing there, Charles stood up, as any Southern gentleman would in the presence of their would-be brutalizers. One of the cops, August T. Mora, took it as a sign of aggression and grabbed Charles. But Charles was no punk, and he fought back. When Mora grabbed his sidearm, Charles grabbed his own. Or maybe Charles grabbed his gun first. Mora told conflicting stories. Both fired, hitting each other in the leg. Charles ran and left a trail of blood. When 2 officers came to his home and attempted to arrest him, he shot and killed them both. The manhunt was on. New Orleans white-owned newspapers wrote stories blaming the officers' deaths on the criminal element in the city's black community. And because Charles was a member of several black organizations, including a society promoting a return to Africa, New Orleans' white community took up arms at the so-called conspiracy. On July 25th, a white mob called for the lynching of Charles's roommate who had committed the crime of being black and present. When their calls went unanswered, they proceeded to go on a black people hunt, shooting at streetcars and in black-owned hair salons, killing at least 6 black people and injuring dozens. For some reason, the white mobs didn't think black people would retaliate, but many were injured during the melee. When the police discovered Charles' whereabouts that Friday, the fugitive killed 2 more police officers who tried to apprehend him. A white mob gathered outside, so Charles started shooting them too. The mayor summoned the state militia, but Charles didn't care. Anybody could get it. By the time a firefighter eventually snuck into the home where Charles was holed up and set a mattress on fire around 5 p.m., Charles had killed or fatally wounded 5 law enforcement officers and wounded another 19 members of the white mob. As he tried to escape, a member of the militia shot and killed him. After he dropped his rifle, the brave policeman riddled his body with bullets as the mob was allowed to beat the corpse. But the white people weren't done. They attempted to burn down every school in the city, successfully razing the best Negro schoolhouse in Louisiana. Black students wouldn't have access to a school for 17 years. After that feat, the white people were sure they had taught New Orleans' black population a valuable lesson. They had not. Robert Charles became a hero to black residents in the city. He would have died had not he raised his hand to resent unprovoked assault and unlawful arrest that fateful Monday night, wrote Ida B. Wells in the definitive account, Mob Rule in New Orleans, Robert Charles and His Fight to Death, The Story of His Life, Burning Human Beings Alive, Other Lynching Statistics. The white people of this country may charge that he was a desperado, but to the people of his own race, Robert Charles will always be regarded as the hero of New Orleans. As the most prominent anti-lynching crusader in America, Wells often advised every black person in the South to arm themselves against the epidemic of lynching, as she did after the lynching of her friend Thomas Moss, because, as she said, "I felt that no one had better die fighting against injustice than to die like a dog or rat in a trap." Similarly, in Richmond, Virginia, polymath John Mitchell Jr. made himself into a national figure by pushing for armed self-defense in his newspaper, the Richmond Planet. Born as a slave in 1863 in Richmond, Mitchell soon proved himself to be a young man of many talents. During high school, he won a slew of oratory contests, graduated first in his class, and also demonstrated an uncanny ability to draw maps by hand, as he showed while applying for an apprenticeship at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. After he learned the printing game, he settled down in the black area of town at age 21 when he was named editor of the Richmond Planet. Mitchell's status as the King of Jackson Ward may have come from the fact that he founded the Mechanics Savings Bank in 1902 and served as its president for 20 years. Or maybe it was his work as a teacher that made him more popular. Perhaps he was so well known for another reason. Johnny wanted all the smoke. Mitchell made his newspaper one of the most respected in the country by traveling around Virginia reporting on lynchings. But he didn't just write about the incidents. He advocated for armed resistance and made sure he practiced what he preached. When a black Jackson Ward resident died during an encounter with the Richmond police officer, Mitchell was indicted for slandering the officer by calling him a murderer. Undeterred, Mitchell went to court and accused the officer again, insisting that he had evidence that the victim had been beaten to death by the cop. The court refused to let him inspect the body, but Mitchell forced his way into the University of Virginia to see the body himself. The charges were dropped, and when he publicly condemned an 1886 lynching in Southside Virginia, racists sent a letter informing him that he would be hanged if he decided to poke that infernal head of yours in this county long enough for us to do it. Believing in the old Negro principle of F around and find out, Mitchell replied to the threat with a quote from Shakespeare. "There are no terrors, Cassius, in your threats, for I am so strong in honesty that they pass me by like the idle winds which I respect not." The brazen journalist grabbed his twin Smith & Wesson pistols, hopped on a train, walked 5 miles to the site of the lynching, and waited for the cowards to come for him. Of course, no one ever showed up. And it didn't stop there. Mitchell wrote that the best remedy for a lyncher or a cursed midnight rider is a 16-shot Winchester rifle in the hands of a dead-shot Negro who has nerve enough to pull the trigger. He was proud of his status as the fighting Negro editor, explaining that it was his job to howl, yes, howl loudly until the American people hear our cries. His popularity earned him the ear of the governor, admiration from his fellow citizens, and a dedicated readership. Mitchell died at his desk on December 3, 1929, and was buried under a tombstone that reads, "Editor, banker, alderman, and pioneer of civil rights, a man who would walk into the jaw of death to serve his race." Black leaders publicly advocating for armed resistance and self-defense was not rare. When he began his work in Montgomery as a pastor and advocate, Martin Luther King Jr. kept a firearm with him. Mitchell often referred to armed self-defense as natural law. Medgar Evers, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, W.E.B. Du Bois, and others were known to keep that thing on him. Although organized efforts for equal rights began even before slavery ended, perhaps the origin of the modern civil rights campaign started when black veterans returned from World War I. Beginning in 1914, 31-year-old Hubert Harrison, who is alternately called Black Socrates, the father of Harlem radicalism and the foremost intellect of his time, left the mostly white socialist movement and founded the New Negro movement. Hubert's intellectual radicalism advocated for a race-conscious international movement for black political, economic, and social power, and inspired the black thinkers who would become the leaders during the civil rights era, including Marcus Garvey, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and Malcolm X. The New Negro movement preached armed self-defense and became contagious among the Black World War I veterans who had seen the world and now refused to subject themselves to the racial terrorism that plagued post-Civil War America. This staunch refusal to bow to white supremacy was taken as an affront by white Southerners, prompting the mass racial violence known as the Red Summer of 1919. But while many of these race riots were one-sided attacks by white lynch mobs, black people refused to lie down and die silently. In July 1919, a 14-year-old girl was allegedly attacked by a black man in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, a town where several white men had been acquitted of lynching an African-American steelworker in 1911. When a rumor surfaced that the police had arrested another black man and were preparing to lynch him, members of the town's black community grabbed their guns, bats, and sticks and went to the town jail. When the mayor and police chief assured them that they hadn't arrested anyone, they marched to the city hall and stormed the building just to make sure. Not only hasn't there been a lynching in the entire state of Pennsylvania since that day, but for some reason, after the Coatesville call to arm, the city became majority black. I wonder why. A few days after the Coatesville call to arms, the white wife of a civilian naval employee was assaulted in Washington, D.C. The local newspapers jumped on it, having riled up local veterans with tales of a Negro fiend who was attacking the wives of sailors. On July 19, 1919, a mob of white veterans tried to lynch the black man accused of the crime, but the crazy white troublemakers took it a step further and tried to bum rush a black neighborhood in D.C. armed with bats and sticks. They tried to do their little lynching thingamajig, but the black neighbors actually had guns and the Caucasian criminals went back to regroup. They organized more mob violence for the second night, but once again, terrorist night out didn't go as planned. Black churches, civic organizations, and regular citizens somehow raised $14,000 in one day to purchase guns and ammunition and stationed sharpshooters on roofs and strategic areas. The unmelanated mob suddenly lost interest when the entire city started shooting at everybody white. 17-year-old Carrie Johnson was arrested and charged with shooting and killing a white police officer from her apartment window during the riots. But when she went to trial, the judge actually believed that she was protecting herself and dropped all charges. Robert F. Williams may have been the biggest badass of them all. Born in 1925, Williams served in the Marines before returning to his hometown in Monroe, North Carolina in 1955 and joining the NAACP. The press estimates that more than half of Monroe's 12,000 residents were members of the KKK. So Williams applied to the National Rifle Association to charter a chapter and formed the Black Guard. Made up of around 60 men who were mostly veterans, they charged themselves with protecting Monroe's black neighborhoods from the white boys in the pointy hats. In 1957, the Klan tried to attack the home of local NAACP Vice President Dr. Albert E. Perry, but the Black Guard had fortified the house with sandbags, and the two groups engaged in a Wild West-style shootout. The Klan never returned, and the city of Monroe banned Klan motorcades. Williams' bold tactics were not just deployed by men in town either. When Dr. Perry was arrested on charges of criminal abortion on a white woman, Williams led a group of armed women to the police station as they surged against the doors, fingering their guns and knives until Perry was produced. And his words were just as radical as his actions. In response to the acquittal of a white man charged with raping Mary Reed, a black woman, Williams said, "We cannot rely on the law. We can get no justice under the present system. If we feel that injustice is done, we must right them and there, on the spot, be prepared to inflict punishment on these people. Since the federal government will not bring a halt to lynching in the South, and since the so-called courts lynch our people legally, if it's necessary to stop lynching with lynching, then we must be willing to resort to that method. We must meet violence with violence." The statement made on the courthouse steps in Monroe prompted the NAACP to suspend him from the organization. But Williams wasn't cast out. He essentially became the de facto security guard for some of the largest civil rights protests. During a 1961 protest for the Freedom Rides, a white mob held Monroe's black community under siege. In the mayhem, a white couple made a wrong turn and wound up in Williams' neighborhood. Williams offered them a place to stay and warned them that he couldn't guarantee their safety if they tried to leave. After a few hours, they left unharmed, but law enforcement agents convinced the couple to say that Williams had kidnapped them, forcing his family to flee the state. On August 28, 1961, the FBI issued a warrant for Williams, charging him with unlawful interstate flight to avoid prosecution, warning agencies that he has advocated and threatened violence and should be considered armed and dangerous. Williams fled to Cuba, where he established a radio station urging black soldiers to participate in an insurrection against the United States. He returned in 1969 and was extradited to North Carolina, and the state immediately dropped all charges. Williams' legacy loomed large. He always noted that his proudest accomplishment was that during the entire existence of the armed guard, no black person under their protection lost their life to racial violence. At his 1996 funeral, Rosa Parks said he should go down in history and never be forgotten. Even religious leaders of the time advocated for armed resistance. When 5 churches, a Masonic hall, and a community center were torched in Jonesboro, Louisiana, 2 different groups united to form the Deacons for Defense and Justice. In 1965, when students picketed the local high school for integration, Klan-affiliated police officers ordered the fire department to turn their hoses on the students. But the firemen quickly changed their mind when 4 deacons showed up with loaded shotguns. The Deacons were the reason why Louisiana Governor John McKeithen became the first Southern governor to capitulate to a civil rights demand by a civil rights organization, facilitating integration in the town city government. But the Deacons weren't just fighting the Klan, they also patrolled their own streets, keeping Jonesboro's black neighborhoods safe. In 1965, when a terrorist cell from the Ku Klux Klan came to Jonesboro to retaliate against black students who finally integrated the high school, the terrorists were turned around by a local chiropractor named James Malcolm Edwards, who just happened to be the Grand Dragon of the Louisiana realm of the United Klans of America. Edwards hadn't suddenly turned into an anti-racist, he just didn't want any smoke with the Deacons. The Deacons helped African American communities form chapters around the country, which of course landed them a spot in the FBI's COINTELPRO program. According to one report in the FBI's 600-page file, the Deacons were inclined to use violence in dealing with any violent opposition encountered in civil rights matters. Speed and his team were hyper-focused on any incidents of arms possession within the black community. California's Mulford Act repealed the right to carry firearms in public after Huey Newton and members of the Black Panthers marched on the state capitol on May 2, 1967. The FBI claimed they were a threat to law enforcement officers too. In 2017, the FBI issued a similar warning about a new threat called Black Identity Extremists. In its report, the agency concluded that it is very likely Black identity extremist, or BIE, perceptions of police brutality against African Americans spurred an increase in premeditated, retaliatory lethal violence against law enforcement and will very likely serve as justification for such violence. More than 5 years later, the FBI still cannot list a single murder caused by a Black identity extremist. In fact, only one person remotely prosecuted was a man named Christopher Daniels, known as Rakim Balagun. According to a court transcript, in 25 months of FBI monitoring, Daniels had not engaged in a single act of violence against an officer or another human being. When the judge asked the FBI if Daniels had resisted arrest, the agent replied that he didn't. The federal agent admitted to the judge that Daniels had never said he wanted to harm a police officer or stated that he planned on doing so. In fact, the only evidence that the FBI offered for Daniels being the subject of 25 months of federal surveillance was his anti-police rhetoric on social media and a few chants at rallies. But the FBI noted that they assessed Daniels as a threat because they had discovered 3 things when they searched his home. He legally bought firearms, he was a founding member of the Huey P. Newton Gun Club, and he owned a copy of Negroes with Guns, the book that is called the single most important intellectual influence on Black Panthers founder Huey P. Newton. It was written by Robert F. Williams. It is possible that Daniels just likes Black history, or maybe he's afraid of losing his civil rights. Oh, wait. Unit review. 3 little questions. 1. Armed self-defense is A. Not incompatible with nonviolent resistance. B. Literally in the Constitution. C. Scary when Black people do it. Or D. A fancy way of saying F around and find out. 2. Black Americans who died practicing self-defense were usually armed with A. Their Second Amendment rights. B. Reverse racism. C. The desire to be free. Or D. Black skin. 3. Blank is an example of a nonviolent white national movement. A. The American Independence Movement. B. The Slave Owners' Rights Movement. C. The Pro-Lynching Movement. Or D. The Anti-Integration Movement. Supplement. All the way free. Dear Tyran, I know you rarely get letters when you're locked up, so I thought I'd write you this one and fill it with some good memories. The last time we saw each other, you were just finished with the bid, and I assumed I get to see my closest cousin all the time. I remember how shocked I was when we were sitting in a hotel room and you told me that you had spent over half your life in state prisons. I guess I hadn't calculated the years, or maybe I just think of you the same way I did when we were younger, as the talented cousin who could sing and cook and draw and paint and play music. That's probably it. I think of you as free. When I think of being free, I think of those few hours we spent on the run in New Jersey. I remember I was about 10, which means you were about 9. You, Geet, Eric, and I spent the summer at Janny's huge 3-story house in New Jersey. Remember how, even though we were all cousins, we told everyone we met that we were brothers because, honestly, we really weren't pretending? I know you remember that we each had our own bedroom, but we would sleep in the mother-in-law suite on the 3rd floor every night. Man, we even had our own kitchen, which was great because you had just learned how to make French toast. Bruh, I guarantee we went through a loaf of bread and a dozen eggs a day, every day for an entire summer. We were on a strict French toast diet. Plus, Aunt Janny had cable with HBO, and she bought us an Atari. And since I am the only one of the male cousins who can't play the drums, of course, we had a drum set. And then Uncle Robert Harriot gave us 4 sets of boxing gloves. No boxing lessons, no training, just boxing gloves for us to beat the hell out of each other. And Geet and Rob had hands like bricks, but since they were the oldest, they beat us up every day. Man, that was the best summer. I loved when we'd go to the garment district in New York and Jenny would drag us around to the most uninteresting part of New York while she shopped for purses and luggage to sell at black conferences around the country. Oh, do you remember the matches? During Aunt Janie's travels, she collected matchbooks from hotels, restaurants, bars, everything, and filled a fishbowl with them until we found them. And when she went to work her regular job at Essex Community College, she'd make us go to the library, and you said it was like the library at Alexandria. That was also the summer I discovered one of the most glorious things that ever existed, walking around with your shirt off. Janie was like, "Why would you put a shirt on if you ain't going nowhere? That's just unnecessary. How come no one ever told us we could just walk around scrawny and bare-chested all day?" He-Man was the only person we'd ever seen do this, but still, Castle Grayskull was in a very secluded area and we were in a downtown East Orange, New Jersey, bawling with our shirt off, running up and down 3 flights of stairs while dribbling a basketball while wearing boxing gloves. Man, it was the greatest summer ever. The only thing we couldn't do was go outside. Aunt Jenny barely let us sit on the porch. She even bought us a basketball hoop and put it in the house. We had no idea that crack was just coming out and she was just trying to keep us safe, but we moaned and groaned about it all summer. I don't know how Aunt Jenny survived. Can you imagine dealing with 4 preteen boys with no bedtimes, hopped up on syrup bread, running around unrestrained, fighting and dribbling a basketball, sweating, arguing, banging drums, watching R-rated movies into the wee hours of the morning while literally playing with fire all day and night? We used to laugh at how Aunt Jenny wasn't born with the ability to modulate the volume of her voice, so she literally screams at everything. The 3rd floor probably smelled like teenage armpits of cinnamon, but we would never clean up because Jenny was going to yell anyway. Like you said, God gave her 2 outside voices and no inside voice, so when she'd tell us to clean up, we'd never do it. Remember that time she came up to vacuum the shag carpeting and got a puzzled look on her face like, "Why is the vacuum picking up all these matches? What is going on?" Man, she hit notes I've only heard high-level sopranos hit. She chased us around that house, but she had no realistic shot at catching us. She put us on punishment, which is to say we had to stay in the house and play video games and eat more French toast and play more basketball and fight more and bang on more drums. Basically, the only thing that changed was we couldn't get our popsicles. She also took the cable box, which meant we couldn't watch the original Clash of the Titans, which was debuting on HBO, and we were outraged. How are we supposed to survive with no HBO and no popsicles? This was America. We had rights. We thought about calling protective services, but do you remember what we did instead? We ran away. From the French toast house, from the shirts optional house, from free trips to the Big Apple and unlimited books, from a castle with basketball and video games and late night breast and all the syrup we could eat. I remember how we stopped at a bodega in a sketchy looking neighborhood and put our money together to buy a bunch of popsicles in those clear plastic sleeves. Geet had on flip-flops and he said his toe meat was burning, which made me laugh uncontrollably. So we sat on the curb, sucking on popsicles, watching the rap battle between a bunch of dudes who said fresh a lot. All summer, Geet would force me to write raps for him, so he convinced me to battle that one dude, and I won. Then all those street dudes from up north gathered around us and started asking us what South Carolina was like and if we rode horses or owned pigs. And then with no map, a bag full of melting popsicles, and a rapidly deteriorating flip-flop toe injury, we continued our journey. We were free. I don't know how we made it to Uncle Rob's house, which was in the next town over in Newark. We had barely made it into his apartment when Janie burst through the door screaming, which was to say she was using her normal voice, about how her nephews had been kidnapped. But when she saw us, she broke down crying. Oh, she said she was going to whip our asses, but she was crying too. Aside from when she caught the Holy Ghost at church, I had never seen her cry. I will never forget that. On the ride back, she railed about how she had given us everything we could want while we sat there silently. She went on and on about how we were ungrateful and no one else would run away from such a luxurious life. When she asked us how we ran away from so much freedom, no one had an answer. Until you pierced that silence and said, "'Cause we ain't all the way free." I think about that a lot. I wonder what all the way free means, and if there is such a thing as kind of free. I'm sure white America considered the formerly enslaved as all the way free when they abolished slavery while creating a loophole that just allowed them to enslave non-whites without calling it slavery. You can read it for yourself. It's written in this little-known document called the Constitution of the United States of America, whose 13th Amendment says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Except as a punishment for crime. Now, instead of calling it slavery or involuntary servitude, they could call it mass incarceration. Instead of private individuals forcing people of color to work for profit, they could force black people to work for the profit of private individuals. To understand how this works, you gotta go back to a period that the great historian Richard Martin Lloyd Walters calls "once upon a time, not long ago, when people wore pajamas and lived life slow." In colonial America, if you were convicted of a crime, you were fined and whipped, banished from the community, or in the worst case scenario, you were sent to the gallows for capital punishment. You know what a gallows is, right? I don't know how much news you get in there, but a few historical reenactors recently built one in front of the U.S. Capitol building just before they stormed in. The good people in Charleston, South Carolina came up with a better solution. They monetized slave whipping. The city offered a menu and a price list to send belligerent or misbehaving Africans to the Sugar House, a municipal building staffed with people who were authorized to inflict violence on enslaved black people for a small fee. Hey, but trust me, cuzzo, these professional torturers didn't use boxing gloves. When southern cities like Savannah adopted this profitable system, they came up with an official sounding name: the Department of Corrections. In 1787, the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons met in Benjamin Franklin's home and came up with the plan for the first modern prison system. Instead of punishing criminals, they encouraged the prisoners to ask for forgiveness or penitence. So they called it a penitentiary. The prisoners were kept in solitary confinement, and when they weren't subject to this inhumane treatment, they worked, prayed, and reflected on their behavior without contact or communication from other prisoners. Even when they were together, they were forced to wear masks so they couldn't see each other. The prison system that was built in Auburn, New York, on the other hand, used corporal punishment, hard work, and silence to rehabilitate prisoners. Inmates were allowed to congregate, but they weren't allowed to talk. By the 1840s, every prison system in America used either the Pennsylvania system or the Auburn system, but regardless of what method they chose to deploy, they all had one thing in common: free labor. Curiously, most of those prisoners were poor white men and white immigrants. In the days before the Civil War, foreign-born immigrants made up 3% of the South's population, but up to 1/3 of the prison system in southern states. Luckily, the 13th Amendment solved this rampant white-on-white crime committed by urban youth by creating a new loophole. They called them black codes. After slaves were freed, every southern state passed vagrancy laws that made it a crime to be unemployed. States like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi also made it illegal to learn a skill or trade without the permission of a white man. Louisiana's Black Code of 1865 required every black person to be in the regular service of some white person or former owner who shall be held responsible for the conduct of said Negro. Texas declared, "It shall be the duty of all sheriffs, justices of the peace, and other civil officers of the several counties of the state to report to the judge of the county court of their respective counties at any time all indigent or vagrant minors within their respective counties or precincts, and also all minors whose parent or parents have not the means or who refuse to support said minor." When black citizens inevitably broke these laws, they were sold to plantations and factory owners to work for free. Remember, slavery was abolished except as a punishment for a crime. So technically, this convict lease system didn't violate the 13th Amendment. Cuzzle, this bootleg form of slavery soon became the most profitable industry in America. We were only kind of free. The Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, the TCI, became one of the original 12 companies listed in the Dow Jones Industrial Average by using a workforce composed mostly of black prison laborers convicted of petty crimes. When TCI was bought by United States Steel, the largest corporation on the planet, in 1907, the company went all in on penal labor. Nationally, convict leasing averaged profits of 267% and was used to mitigate the growing demands of an increasingly unionized workforce in the early 1900s. And the profit wasn't restricted to private entities. In 1898, 73% of Alabama's entire state budget came from convict leasing. Following that example, in 1934, the U.S. government created a wholly owned government corporation called Federal Prison Industries to profit from prison labor. Because these corporations were not required to offer a minimum standard of human rights to their enslaved souls, torture, abuse, and sexual assault were rampant. Malaria, pneumonia, and tuberculosis ravaged the prison population. 41% of Alabama's convict lessees died during their terms of incarceration in 1870, and Mississippi's prison death rate in the 1880s was 9 times the rate of prisons in the North. Still, the death rate would have been higher if states didn't have a policy of releasing terminally ill inmates, so the prison system wouldn't have to bear the burden of burying its enslaved profit makers. When states began outlawing convict leasing between 1925 and 1930, guess what happened, Ty? The black incarceration rate plummeted to the lowest rate since slavery ended, but we were only a little bit free. You know, they had something up their sleeves, and it wasn't no popsicle. In 1978, President Nixon fixed the profit problem by declaring a war on drugs. In 1970, almost 200,000 Americans were in prison. By 1985, there were almost 482,000. By the end of 2019, there were 1.4 million people locked up in U.S. prisons, and black Americans were incarcerated at nearly 5 times the rate of whites. Private prisons aren't the only ones profiting from this stolen labor. It's the $1.3 billion earned by telecom companies that have exclusive contracts with prison systems. It's the food companies that make $1.6 billion from prison commissaries. It's the insurance industry that makes $1.4 billion in bail fees. And it's not just the federal government. California uses prison labor to fight wildfires. Your favorite fast food restaurant uses prison labor to process meat. Your furniture, license plate, and many of your clothes are made by prison labor. I know I don't have to tell you this. You're in South Carolina, where black people make up around 28% of the population and 58% of the state's incarcerated people. I remember you told me that you work in the kitchen, so you probably aren't one of the people who make between 35 cents and $2 per hour making mattresses, golf carts, and office furniture for the state. I wonder what would happen if the state of South Carolina put the $59.61 it spends per prisoner every day toward drug treatment, education, and criminal justice reform. Trust me, cuz I'm not saying people shouldn't be held responsible for committing crimes, but I can't help but wonder how black people are incarcerated for drugs at 3 times the rate of whites when white people use more drugs. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's 2020 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, 48.7% of black adults had used illegal drugs in their lifetime, compared to 58.9% of non-Hispanic whites. How is it that black people are arrested for 26% of the crimes but are incarcerated in state prisons at 5 times the rate of whites? I know you don't have the answers. I'm just asking why we are always kind of free. I know it's not fair because I can remember when I almost went to jail for you. Don't act like you don't remember when the police beat me up for the Kwanzaa Cup. All I was trying to do was see you sing with your boy band Mass Appeal, which I'm sure you can admit now was basically a knockoff of New Edition without the Jerry curls or the hit songs. It was the night before Christmas, and Mass Appeal was set to battle the notorious rap group Posse in the huge Christmas Eve talent show. The talent show was an event. High schoolers from near and far, mostly near, went to witness the year's hottest entertainment event. I still remember you saying it wasn't the Posse, stupid, just Posse. Basically, bruh, it was the first versus battle. The Christmas talent show was the most anticipated show of the year, and I had to be there to support you. I promise, it was not about the high school girls who were going to be there, that I would get to be the cousin from out of town, or the fact that there was going to be a high school after party where students could grind their pelvic bones into dust, slow dance into Guy featuring Teddy Riley. This is all about supporting you. There was only one problem. I was broke and I didn't have a ride. Luckily, I had a solution for this. You know, our family celebrates Kwanzaa as if it's Negro Christmas. Well, I still had to get my Kwanzaa presents. My plan was to take the money my mom gave me for Kwanzaa shopping, buy some cheap BS, and use the rest to ball out at your talent show. Luckily, I found a ride with my classmate Lydell Hawkins. You remember Lydell? Big dude, football player. He drove that 1977 Plymouth Volare with the burgundy top. Every drug dealer in town offered him money for that car because it was clean and in vintage shape. Because his name also began with an H, Lydell and I have been friends for years because we had homeroom together every year since 7th grade. So on Kwanzaa Eve, we went to the Magnolia Mall, which was crazy crowded, and I found the perfect gift, a Kwanzaa cup. It was basically a coffee mug where the Kwanzaa principles would appear when the cup had hot liquid in it. Having secured the Kwanzaa bag, we headed to the show. There were a million acts that night, but only two mattered, Posse and Mass Appeal. Everyone knew what Posse was going to do. First of all, Posse had more members than a Baptist church choir, and their members changed all the time. Their entire shtick was that each member would rap about anything they wanted, but the chorus was always the same. Hey, we want some posse. What you want, girl? Hey, we want some posse. What you need, girl? Hey, we want some posse. Posse wouldn't sing the chorus. They would select the finest 10th and 11th grade girls to chant the chorus and dance as Posse girls. Yes, Posse had its own cheerleading team as backup dancers. Didn't you used to go with a Posse girl at one time? Man, dating a Posse girl was like dating one of Destiny's Children back then. They were basically the Victoria's Secret models of our youth. Anyway, Posse killed it. You know I love you, bruh, but I gotta be honest. Posse was dope that night. I felt sorry for y'all. Ain't no way Mass Appeal was gonna outdo the Wu-Tang Clan. But when it was time for Mass Appeal, y'all did an entire medley of hit R&B songs beginning with Belle Biv DeVoe's warning to never trust a big butt and a smile, and ending with High Fives, I Like the Way, the kissing game, all while wearing the BBD airbrushed overall shorts and the Malcolm X hats. Look, it was the 90s. In case you didn't know, the only thing women like more than clever puns, women like puns, right? Is dudes who can sing falsetto. And I won't lie, y'all sang. If I wasn't trying to be cool and pull a straight Posse girl, I definitely would have cheered for Mass Appeal. But y'all won anyway. Even Lydell got some action. And by getting some action, I mean walking a girl outside and getting her phone number, because that meant you were really doing it in the 11th grade. Basking in all that high school glory, I totally forgot my curfew and I knew I was going to be in trouble. There was the small possibility that I could sneak into my room, which had its own door that led to the outside, without Mama hearing me, so I instructed Lydell to let me out on the corner, and I would walk home, eliminating the chance that his loud-ass old-school car would steer my mom out of her Kwanzaa Eve slumber. Lydell didn't even make it a block before he noticed that I'd left the Kwanzaa cup in his car. He swooped around, pulled up next to me, handed my Kwanzaa gift through the car window, and drove away while I started my walk back home. Back then, our childhood home was 1 block away from the street that was basically a Walmart for crack. 8th Street had every variety of crack. The crack rocks, the crack cookies, the crack that was whack, the crack that killed Applejack, all the cracks. So at 1 a.m. on Kwanzaa Eve, what looked like a strange dope boy's car pulled up next to me, handed me something through the window, and disappeared into the night. Now that I think about it, I can see how that looks suspicious. To be fair, when the cops jumped out of nowhere, I probably looked like I was a little high off cocaine. My clothes were askew, I was tired, I was coming from 8th Street and was yelling some nonsense about being careful with my package. As they searched for the crack I had obviously thrown away, with one officer keeping his knee on my back, I didn't even try to argue. All I could do was try to save my own life. I begged and I pleaded with everything I had. Oh, I didn't care if they shot me in the head or anything. I just didn't want them to break my mama's Kwanzaa cup. When they smashed my Kwanzaa cup to bits and let me go, I was devastated. I swear to you, of all the things I have ever seen police do, and I have seen police kill people, the saddest, most pitiful I have ever felt is walking that 200 yards or so after the cops stomped on my mother's $6 Kwanzaa cup. And when I got home, my mom was waiting, and I didn't even try to defend myself. I just listened to my mother yell at me. She yelled at me for being late. Then she yelled at me for being selfish and spending money on a talent show. My mother can lay a guilt trip with the best of them, and it was worse than having a knee at my neck. Even worse, everything she said was right. All she ever tried to do was make us happy. She never cared about a Kwanzaa gift, but I'm sure she was upset that her only son would rather slow dance with second-string posse girls than get her a damn Kwanzaa gift. I had one job. My sisters gave my mom her Kwanzaa gifts that year. I felt so bad because the Kwanzaa gift for mom was not only an in-house competition, it was a tradition. I know my mom was hurt because I could see it in her eyes. A few days later, or maybe even the next day, a neighbor who saw the entire incident with the cops told my mom that the police had beat me up. She tried to file a complaint, but nothing ever came of it. When she calmed down, she let loose another rant about hanging out in the streets late at night. And halfway through her lecture, she started crying. I tried to tell her that I had just gone to see you in the talent show, but she didn't stop her Janny-level soprano rant. That's when I realized that my mom wasn't worried about the dope boys. She knew those dudes on the corner of 8th Street wouldn't bother me. If anything, they'd protect me. She wasn't lecturing me about the danger of drugs. She knew I wasn't using the cracks, as she called it. She wasn't even going off about missing my curfew. She was concerned about what the cops could have done to me. What if they have taken you to jail, she asked. Do you want to throw your life away? Being innocent doesn't mean anything to the police. You think they care? To them, you're just another black boy in America. I think about that a lot. I think about you a lot. You are the closest thing I will ever have to a brother. Now that I can see the different trajectories our lives have taken, I understand the privilege of contemplating absolute freedom. You are in a state-sanctioned loophole that legalized enslavement, and I am just a black man in America. And neither one of us is all the way free. I love you, cuz. Mikey. Unit review. 3 little questions. Number 1. Why did the mass incarceration system accelerate after slavery was outlawed? A. To continue profiting from free labor. B. Because states created laws targeting black people. C. It's probably a coincidence. Or D. Wait, when was slavery outlawed? Number 2. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Why doesn't it have the lowest crime rate? A. Because incarceration doesn't stop crime. B. Crime is caused by poverty, not lack of cages. C. It's probably a coincidence. Or D. Seriously, was slavery outlawed? 3. Who profits from mass incarceration? A. Corporate-run private prisons that receive state and federal funding. B. The people who get free labor. C. No one. Or D. Seriously, you mentioned earlier that slavery was outlawed. Did that seriously happen?